Meditations on the Tarot, A Journey into Christian Hermeticism by Valentin Tomberg is a profound, spiritual text that blends Christian mysticism, esoteric philosophy, and symbolic interpretation of the Tarot's major arcana. Rather than treating the Tarot as a tool for fortune-telling, Tomberg presents each card as a spiritual archetype that reveals deeper truths about the human soul and its relationship with God. The book unfolds as a series of anonymous letters written to an unknown friend, guiding readers through contemplations on love, wisdom, sacrifice, prayer, and transformation. Rooted in Christian Hermeticism, it seeks to bridge the mystical traditions of Christianity with universal esoteric wisdom, offering a path toward inner development, spiritual maturity, and a deeper communion with the divine. Valentin Tomberg, 1900 to 1973, was a Russian-born philosopher, mystic, and esoteric Christian thinker whose work bridged the realms of law, theology, and spirituality. Born in St. Petersburg, he emigrated to Western Europe after the Russian Revolution and eventually settled in the Netherlands, where he became a respected scholar of law and comparative religion, deeply influenced by Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy before moving toward Catholicism. Tomberg's spiritual journey reflected an integration of Eastern Orthodox roots, Western esotericism, and Catholic mysticism. Although Meditations on the Tarot was published anonymously after his death, it is considered his magnum opus and has become a cornerstone in modern Christian Hermetic thought, admired for its intellectual depth, humility, and profound spiritual insight. Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot is not a book about fortune-telling or occult practices in the popular sense, but a deeply spiritual text that uses the imagery of the Tarot's major arcana as a framework for contemplating Christian Hermetic wisdom. From the very beginning, Tomberg emphasizes that his work is written in the form of letters to an unknown friend. This literary device creates an intimate tone, as though the author is personally guiding the reader on a spiritual journey. The anonymous voice reflects humility, reminding us that true esoteric teaching is not about the personality of the teacher, but about the timeless wisdom being transmitted. The Tarot becomes a symbolic language for exploring profound mysteries of existence, the soul, and humanity's relationship with God. Each card is treated as a doorway to spiritual reflection, much like icons in the Christian tradition, where images are not ends in themselves, but windows to divine reality. The introduction sets the stage by grounding the meditations in Christian Hermeticism. Hermeticism here refers not to secretive magical practices, but to the spiritual wisdom attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which emphasizes divine knowledge, correspondence between the earthly and heavenly realms, and the inner transformation of the human being. Tomberg blends this with Christianity, showing how Christ is the ultimate key to all mysteries. He argues that esotericism without Christ risks becoming an exercise in pride or manipulation, while Christianity without esotericism may lose its living depth. This synthesis is central to the whole book. Every meditation reflects on how universal spiritual wisdom finds its fulfillment in Christ. The Logos, the living Word of God, the Tarot, then, is not a tool for predicting the future, but a contemplative ladder leading the soul toward divine truth. The first meditation begins with the Magician Arcana. The magician represents the beginning of the spiritual path, the archetype of initiative, consciousness, and creativity. In Tomberg's view, the magician embodies the principle of attention and concentration, which are the foundations of any spiritual practice. The image of the magician standing before his table of instruments suggests the human being placed in the world with tools of mind, body, and spirit, ready to engage in the work of transformation. The magician is not a sorcerer in the negative sense, but a symbol of the human soul awakening to its God-given capacities. His raised hand and focused gaze remind us that true power comes not from domination or manipulation, but from aligning with divine will. Tomberg stresses that the magician's power is rooted in conscious attention. Spiritual growth begins with learning to direct the mind to hold attention without distraction and to open oneself to inspiration from above. This is what distinguishes creative activity from mere mechanical repetition. For Tomberg, the act of attention itself is a prayer, a silent openness to the higher world. The magician teaches that the first step on the esoteric path is not to seek powers or secret knowledge, but to learn to be present, awake, and receptive to God's guidance. In addition, the magician reveals the interplay of freedom and grace. The tools on his table suggest human faculties, but without divine illumination they remain lifeless. The magician's gesture reminds us that everything must be offered to God. Otherwise, knowledge and skill risk being misused. Thus, the magician is a call to humility at the very outset of the journey. He represents the awakening of human responsibility, but also the recognition that the true source of wisdom is beyond the human ego. By starting with the magician, Tomberg establishes the tone for the entire book. Spiritual development is not about escaping the world, but about engaging it with renewed consciousness. Every meditation that follows builds on this principle, that symbols, when approached with reverence and openness, become living channels of grace. The magician is the doorway into the mysteries, reminding us that esotericism is not about secret power, but about the sanctification of life through attention, love, and humility. The second meditation turns to the High Priestess Arcana II, a figure seated calmly between two pillars with a scroll or book on her lap. In Tomberg's interpretation, she represents sacred knowledge, intuition, and the mystery of revelation, while the magician symbolizes active initiative and conscious attention. The High Priestess embodies receptivity, silence, and contemplation. She is the soul turned inward, receptive to the wisdom of God. Tomberg draws a parallel between her and the Blessed Virgin Mary, who received the divine word in her womb not through activity, but through humble openness. The High Priestess thus embodies the principle that true wisdom comes not from intellectual effort alone, but from listening, stillness, and grace. Tomberg emphasizes that the High Priestess teaches the art of reading the book of life, that is, discerning divine truth written into creation and Scripture. The book she holds is not just human knowledge, but divine wisdom, which is revealed gradually to those who purify their hearts. For Tomberg, this purification is crucial. Intellectual brilliance without humility leads to pride, while true understanding requires a quiet heart willing to be taught by the Spirit. The pillars beside her echo the entrance to the Temple of Solomon, reminding the reader that knowledge of God is a sacred mystery approached only through reverence. In this sense, the high priestess is the archetype of esoteric Christianity itself, where truth is received as revelation rather than invented by the mind. Where the magician shows that attention is the starting point, the high priestess deepens the lesson by teaching silence. She calls the seeker to cultivate interior stillness so that the soul may become a mirror for divine truth. Tomberg stresses that without this receptive dimension, spiritual practice becomes unbalanced. Just as masculine and feminine principles are complementary, so too are activity and receptivity on the spiritual path. The high priestess reveals that contemplation, prayer, and reverent silence are as vital as active striving. She represents the hidden wisdom of the Church, the mystery of the sacraments, and the inner life of the soul waiting for God's voice. The third meditation moves to the Empress Arcanum 3, a figure who embodies creativity, fruitfulness, and divine inspiration made manifest. If the high priestess is wisdom in potential, the Empress is wisdom in action, bringing forth life, beauty, and truth. Tomberg interprets her as the archetype of holy imagination, the faculty that allows spiritual truths to be expressed in symbols, art, culture, and even social life. Where the high priestess guards the hidden word, the Empress gives it form and expression, clothing the invisible and the visible. Tomberg links the Empress with the concept of Sophia, divine wisdom personified, as well as with the Holy Spirit as the life-giving power at work in creation. She symbolizes the fertility of the spiritual life, where inner revelation blossoms into outward action. For the seeker, the Empress teaches that authentic creativity is not about ego-driven originality, but about allowing divine inspiration to flow through one's talents. This applies not only to artists or thinkers, but to anyone who shapes life with love, parents, teachers, leaders, or builders of community. A key theme Tomberg develops is the relationship between imagination and truth. The Empress reveals that imagination is not mere fantasy, but a sacred faculty when purified by the Spirit. Through imagination, symbols, rituals, and art become vehicles of divine wisdom. But when imagination is detached from truth, it can become destructive illusion. Thus, the Empress challenges the seeker to discern between false creations of ego and true creations inspired by God. Her crown and throne represent authority, but unlike worldly power, hers is based on nurturing life and radiating wisdom. Together, the high priestess and the Empress form a pair. The high priestess teaches receiving truth in silence, while the Empress teaches expressing truth through creative manifestation. One is contemplation, the other is action. One is hidden, the other visible. Tomberg shows how the spiritual path requires both. Without contemplation, action becomes shallow. Without expression, contemplation remains sterile. By meditating on these figures, the reader is invited to balance inner stillness with fruitful creativity, so that divine wisdom may not only be received, but also lived out in the world. The next meditation explores the Emperor Arcanum 4, who represents structure, order, authority, and stability. If the Empress expresses the principle of creative fruitfulness, the Emperor provides the framework within which that creativity can flourish. He symbolizes law, justice, and the establishment of form. Tomberg interprets the emperor as the archetype of divine order reflected in human society. His throne and scepter indicate responsibility and rulership, but unlike worldly tyranny, his authority should be understood as service to the divine harmony of creation. For Tomberg, the emperor is a reminder that spirituality must not float in abstraction. It must also be incarnated in concrete structures. Just as the cosmos is ordered by divine law, so too must human life, communities, and even nations reflect that order. However, the emperor warns against confusing divine authority with authoritarian control. True rulership is rooted in humility and alignment with God's law, not in domination. This makes him a deeply Christian figure, echoing Christ's teaching that the greatest among you must be the servant of all. The emperor challenges the seeker to integrate spiritual truth into daily life by establishing order, discipline, and responsibility in one's personal and social existence. Tomberg also emphasizes the symbolic meaning of the emperor's position in the sequence of the Arcana. Coming after the empress, he shows that creativity without structure risks chaos, while order without creativity becomes sterile rigidity. Together they balance each other. The empress gives birth to new life, and the emperor sustains it with law and form. On the spiritual path, this means that the seeker must not only receive wisdom and express it, but also embody within a life of coherence and integrity. The emperor thus represents the sanctification of earthly order, pointing to the truth that all genuine authority must serve God's kingdom. The fifth meditation turns to the Pope, also called the Hierophant, Arcanum V. This figure represents spiritual authority, tradition, and the transmission of divine teaching. Seated on a throne, blessing with his hand and holding a staff, the Pope is the archetype of the spiritual guide. Tomberg sees him as a symbol of the living continuity of wisdom through the Church, which safeguards and communicates divine truth across generations. If the emperor symbolizes earthly order, the Pope represents heavenly order made manifest in doctrine, sacraments, and the guidance of the Spirit. Tomberg is careful to distinguish between spiritual authority and authoritarianism. The Pope does not impose truth by force, but offers it as a channel of grace. His blessing gesture symbolizes the transmission of spiritual power, not as personal possession, but as a gift entrusted to him. This reflects the Christian understanding of apostolic succession and the teaching authority of the Church. But Tomberg also interprets the figure universally. Every true teacher or guide who transmits divine wisdom participates in this archetype. The Pope thus represents the principle of spiritual tradition, the passing on of living truth, not merely in words but in spirit. The Pope also teaches the balance between faith and reason. Whereas a high priestess symbolizes silent reception of wisdom, and the empress symbolizes creative expression, the Pope embodies the ordered communication of wisdom in a form accessible to humanity. He represents the sacraments, liturgy, and spiritual practices that connect believers with the divine. For Tomberg, this archetype reminds the seeker that spiritual life is not a purely individual path. It unfolds within a greater tradition and community, guided by those who have been entrusted with spiritual authority. The relationship between the emperor and the Pope is especially important. Together they symbolize the harmony of the temporal and the spiritual, the state and the church, the visible and the invisible order. Historically, this relationship has often been fraught with tension, but in Tomberg's vision, the ideal is complementarity. The emperor governs external order, while the Pope governs inner meaning. The seeker is thus called to integrate both dimensions, to live responsibly within the structures of the world while remaining guided by spiritual wisdom and grace. At this stage of the meditations, Tomberg has outlined a rhythm of the spiritual path. The magician awakens attention. The high priestess teaches receptivity. The empress expresses creativity. The emperor provides structure, and the Pope transmits spiritual authority. Together they form a sequence of growth, moving from inner awakening to the embodiment of divine wisdom in both personal and communal life. Each arcanum builds upon the previous one, showing how the tarot, in Tomberg's interpretation, is less a series of isolated symbols and a coherent spiritual journey toward union with God. The sixth meditation centers on the Lover's Arcanum VI, a card that depicts a figure choosing between two paths, often symbolized by two women, with an angel or divine presence above. For Tomberg, the Lovers represents the mystery of choice, the moment when the human soul must decide between the way of ego and the way of God, between lower desire and higher love. This card captures the drama of human freedom, unlike the earlier Arcana, which emphasize receptivity, creativity, and authority. The Lovers reveals that the essence of the spiritual path lies in the freedom to choose rightly. Tomberg explains that the human soul is constantly placed before two possibilities, selfishness or self-giving love. The two figures symbolize not merely external choices, but the internal struggle between ego and spirit. The angel above reminds us that true freedom is not found in following whims, but in aligning with divine love. In Christian Hermeticism, freedom is inseparable from responsibility. Every choice shapes the soul's destiny. The Lovers, therefore, is not only about romantic or emotional love, but about the deepest decision of life, whether to live for oneself or to live for God. At the same time, Tomberg emphasizes that choice is not merely an individual burden, but a grace-filled encounter. The divine presence in the image signifies that God respects human freedom, but also illumines it. Love itself is the guiding principle that reveals the right path. The Lovers teaches that the spiritual journey is not a denial of love, but its transfiguration, moving from instinctual passion to spiritual devotion, from possessive desire to selfless gift. In this way, the card reveals the mystery of love as both a human reality and a divine calling, showing that the highest form of freedom is to choose love and union with God's will. The seventh meditation turns to the Chariot, Arcanum 7, which symbolizes victory, mastery, and the integration of opposing forces. The image often depicts a figure riding a chariot drawn by two animals or sphinxes, one light and one dark, representing duality. For Tomberg, the chariot represents the triumph of the soul that has achieved harmony between conflicting tendencies, reason and instinct, spirit and body, freedom and law. It is not a triumph of domination, but of balance and alignment with the divine order. Tomberg interprets the chariot as the archetype of the soul that has chosen rightly, as shown in the lovers, and now moves forward with spiritual strength. The charioteer does not drive by brute force, but by inner mastery. The two animals symbolize the tensions within human nature. 10. The chariot represents the will guided by divine authority. In this sense, the chariot is the image of the disciplined soul that has united contemplation, tent action, freedom and responsibility, inner life and outer life. This card also speaks a spiritual mission. Having chosen the path of divine love, the seeker is now entrusted with carrying that love into the world. The crown and armor of the charioteer symbolize readiness for spiritual battle, not against external enemies, but against the inner tendencies that would pull the soul off course. The victory of the chariot is not conquest over others, but self-mastery, which allows the soul to serve as a vessel for divine truth. Together, the lovers and the chariot form a natural sequence. The lovers presents the decisive moment of choice. The chariot shows the fruit of that choice, the harmonious integration of the soul that follows, alignment with God's will. One is the test, the other is the reward. Tomberg uses these meditations to show that freedom and discipline, love and mastery are not opposites, but aspects of the same spiritual path. The true victory of the soul is not in escaping struggle, but in transforming it into harmony under divine guidance. At this point in the journey, the seeker has moved from attention and receptivity to creativity, order, authority, and now to choice and victory. The tarot's sequence continues to unfold as a map of the soul's ascent toward God, each arcanum deepening the understanding of what it means to live in harmony with divine wisdom. The 8th meditation is on Justice Arcanum 8, a card often depicted as a crowned figure seated with a sword in one hand and scales in the other. For Tomberg, justice represents truth, equilibrium, and the law of divine harmony, while the Emperor symbolizes external order and the Pope's spiritual authority. Justice brings these principles into the inner life of the soul. She embodies the balance between thought and action, freedom and responsibility, mercy and truth. Justice is not merely legal correctness, but the alignment of the soul with divine reality. Tomberg emphasizes that justice teaches discernment. The scales symbolize the weighing of motives and actions, while the sword represents the clarity of truth that cuts through illusion. In Christian Hermetic thought, justice is inseparable from love, for divine justice is not retribution, but restoration, the setting right of relationships according to truth. Justice thus calls the seeker to examine one's own life, not by external standards alone, but by the inner voice of conscience illumined by grace. It is a meditation on integrity, reminding us that spiritual growth requires not only inspiration and creativity, but also rigorous honesty with oneself. An important theme in this meditation is the relationship between justice and freedom. Tomberg insists that freedom without truth becomes destructive, while truth without freedom becomes oppression. Justice mediates between the two, ensuring that freedom serves truth and truth respects freedom. In this sense, justice reflects the logos, the divine order that undergirds creation, and calls the soul to live in harmony with it. She is not cold impartiality, but living wisdom, a balance that reflects God's own nature as both merciful and just. For the seeker, justice means developing the capacity for discernment, humility, and fairness in all relationships, both inward and outward. The ninth meditation turns to the hermit, Arcana mix, a cloaked figure holding a lantern, symbolizing wisdom and inner guidance. Tomberg interprets the hermit as the archetype of solitude, inwardness, and spiritual illumination. If justice represents the clear order of truth in life, the hermit represents the inner process of discovering the truth in silence and withdrawal. The lantern in his hand symbolizes the light of divine wisdom that shines not with blinding brilliance, but with gentle clarity, guiding the seeker step by step. For Tomberg, the hermit is not an image of isolation, but of interior depth. He represents the soul's need for periods of silence, prayer, and reflection away from the noise of the world. Just as the high priestess symbolizes contemplation, the hermit embodies the lived reality of contemplative life. His path is not outwardly grand, but inwardly luminous. The seeker learns that true wisdom is not found in external achievements, but in the quiet listening of the heart to God's voice. The hermit also teaches the principle of patience. His slow, deliberate steps show that spiritual progress is not about speed or ambition, but about steady faithfulness. The lantern lights only a small space ahead, reminding us that God does not reveal the entire path at once, but gives enough light for the next step. This is the virtue of trust, walking in faith, guided by a light that is sufficient but not overwhelming. Together, justice and the hermit reveal two dimensions of spiritual discernment. Justice is the external principle of balance and truth, while the hermit is the inward process of finding that balance through reflection and prayer. One is the standard, the other the practice. Justice shows the universal law, the hermit shows the personal journey. Tomberg presents them as complementary. The seeker must both discern truth in the world and cultivate the inner stillness to perceive it rightly. At this stage of the meditations, the tarot presents a deepening of the spiritual path. Having made the choice of love and achieved harmony in the chariot, the seeker is now called to live in truth and integrity through justice, and to cultivate inner wisdom through the hermit. The path unfolds not as a straight line, but as a spiral, returning again and again to the themes of freedom, discernment, and divine illumination at ever deeper levels. The 10th meditation turns to the Wheel of Fortune, Arcana X, a card that depicts a great wheel turning, often with figures rising and falling along its rim. Tomberg interprets it as the symbol of cyclical change, destiny, and the ever-shifting conditions of life. It reflects the reality that earthly existence is marked by ups and downs, gains and losses, moments of triumph and moments of decline. The wheel reminds the seeker that nothing in the material world is permanent, and therefore attachment to temporal success or fear of failure leads only to instability. For Tomberg, the Wheel of Fortune points beyond mere fatalism. While it acknowledges the inevitability of change, it also reveals that there is a center, a still point at the heart of the wheel, where the soul can find stability. Those who cling to the outer rim are swept around by the endless cycles of fortune, but those who discover the center live in contact with the eternal. This is the spiritual meaning of detachment, not indifference to life's events, but freedom from being enslaved by them. The wheel teaches that true stability is found only in God, the unchanging center of existence. Tomberg also interprets the wheel in light of providence. What may appear as random chance or blind fate is, in truth, the unfolding of divine wisdom. Fortune is not an arbitrary force, but a veil behind which God's providence operates. For the seeker, the lesson is to trust that both rises and falls serve a higher purpose. By remaining centered, one learns to see every change, whether joyful or painful, as a call to deeper faith and humility. The wheel thus invites the reader to transcend the illusions of worldly success and failure, and to live from the stillness of the eternal. The 11th meditation is on strength, Arcana 11, often depicted as a woman gently taming a lion. This image, for Tomberg, represents the victory of spiritual strength over brute force, the power of love, and patience over violence and pride. Unlike worldly strength, which dominates through aggression, this strength is gentle, inward, and rooted in communion with God. The serene woman closing the lion's mouth shows that true mastery does not crush or destroy but transforms and harmonizes. Tomberg interprets strength as the archetype of moral courage and spiritual resilience. It is the power to endure trials without bitterness, to resist temptation without pride, and to confront evil without hatred. The lion symbolizes the instincts and passions within the human soul, which are not to be annihilated, but disciplined and transfigured. The gentle manner of the figure shows that the transformation of passions comes not through violent repression, but through patience, love, and grace. A key insight here is the difference between external and internal strength. External strength is about control and domination. Internal strength is about mastery of self. The woman's crown and infinite symbol above her head show that her strength is spiritual, flowing from her connection to the eternal. This is the strength of the saints, who often appeared outwardly weak, but displayed unshakable inner power. For Tomberg, this card reveals the secret of Christian virtue, that weakness in the eyes of the world may conceal the highest form of strength when united with God's will. The wheel of fortune and strength form a natural pair. The wheel teaches detachment from the fluctuations of life, while strength teaches endurance and transformation in the midst of those fluctuations. One shows the impermanence of outer circumstances, the other shows the permanence of inner virtue. Together they guide the seeker toward a life rooted in the eternal center, able to withstand change with patience and courage. At this point in the meditations, Tomberg has drawn the seeker deeper into the mysteries of spiritual resilience, from the lessons of choice and harmony in the lovers and the chariot. The path has moved into truth and discernment, with justice and the hermit, and now into detachment and inner strength with the wheel and strength. Each step builds a foundation for the next, preparing the soul for even greater trials and revelations in the journey toward union with God. The 12th meditation contemplates the Hanged Man, Arcana 12, an image of a figure suspended upside down, often by one foot, in a posture of calm surrender. Tomberg interprets this not as punishment, but as a symbol of voluntary sacrifice, inversion of values, and spiritual surrender to God's will. The Hanged Man represents the paradox of the spiritual path. What seems like defeat in the eyes of the world is victory in the eyes of heaven. Tomberg explains that the hanged man embodies the principle of renunciation. To progress spiritually, one must be willing to let go of worldly attachments, personal ambitions, and even the conventional sense of success. The inversion of the figure symbolizes the reversal of worldly values. What the world calls weakness, faith sees as strength. What the world calls loss, faith recognizes as gain. This card invites the seeker to embrace the cross of Christ, where apparent humiliation becomes the highest revelation of divine love. The calm expression of the hanged man shows that this is not forced suffering, but chosen surrender. Tomberg emphasizes that authentic spiritual life involves sacrifice, but not for the sake of self-denial alone. Sacrifice becomes meaningful when offered in love and union with God's will. The hanged man teaches the seeker to accept suffering not as meaningless tragedy, but as an opportunity for transformation and participation in Christ's redemptive work. He symbolizes the mysterious truth that freedom is found in surrender, and that the soul is exalted when it humbles itself before God. The 13th meditation turns to Death Arcanum 13, one of the most feared yet misunderstood symbols of the tarot. Tomberg insists that this card is not a morbid image, but a profound reminder of transformation, endings, and the passage into new life. Death is depicted as a skeletal figure with a scythe cutting down forms to make way for renewal. For Tomberg, the card reveals the spiritual truth that death is not annihilation, but transition, the destruction of what is temporary so that what is eternal may be born. On a spiritual level, death represents the process of inner purification. Just as the physical body will one day perish, so too must the false self, the ego built on pride, fear, and illusion, be dissolved. The card invites the seeker to practice dying before death, meaning the continual letting go of attachments, illusions, and false identities. Only through this inner death can the true self, the soul united with God, come forth in freedom. Tomberg links this idea to the Christian teaching of resurrection. Death is not the final word, but the gateway to new life in Christ. Tomberg also reflects on the mystery of physical death itself. He presents it not as a punishment, but as a merciful gift, allowing the soul to pass beyond the limitations of earthly existence. Death, he argues, is a teacher that reminds us of the impermanence of all things and calls us to live in the light of eternity. By meditating on death, the seeker learns detachment, humility, and hope. Rather than fearing it, one can accept it as part of the divine order, trusting that the soul's true destiny lies beyond the grave. The hanged man and death, when considered together, form a profound sequence. The hanged man shows the necessity, voluntary sacrifice, and the inversion of worldly values, while death reveals the ultimate transformation that sacrifice prepares us for. One teaches surrender, the other renewal. Together they remind the seeker that the path to life passes through death, not only physical death, but the continual dying to self that makes space for God's life within us. At this stage of the meditations, Tomberg leads the reader into the heart of the Christian mystery: sacrifice, death, and resurrection. The journey is no longer about harmony or resilience alone, but about radical transformation. The tarot here becomes a mirror of the gospel, teaching that true life is found not in clinging to the old, but in allowing the old to pass away so that the new may come. The 14th meditation turns to Temperance Arcanum 14, a card showing an angel gently pouring liquid from one vessel into another. Tomberg interprets this as the archetype of harmony, integration, and the unification of opposites. If death represented dissolution and radical transformation, temperance represents the reordering and healing that follows. It is the balance of fire and water, spirit and matter, activity and receptivity. The angel's calm action suggests that the process is not forced, but flows naturally when the soul is attuned to divine wisdom. Tomberg emphasizes that temperance teaches the principle of cooperation with grace. Spiritual growth is not accomplished through extremes or violent effort, but through moderation, patience, and trust. The mixing of the two substances symbolizes the blending of different aspects of the human being, intellect and emotion, body and spirit, freedom and law, into a harmonious whole. The angel reveals that this integration is possible only through the work of the Holy Spirit, who unites what appears irreconcilable. For the seeker, temperance is an invitation to cultivate equilibrium in daily life. It does not mean dull compromise, but the dynamic balance that comes when everything is placed in right relationship under God, just as the angel combines elements without confusion or destruction. So the soul is called to unite its powers in service of divine harmony. This card reassures the seeker that after the trials of sacrifice and death, renewal and balance are possible. It is the image of spiritual healing, where the fragments of the self are gathered into a living unity. The 15th meditation addresses the Devil Arcanum 15, one of the most challenging symbols in the tarot. The card depicts a horned figure with chain figures beneath him, representing bondage to sin, illusion, and false freedom. Tomberg interprets the devil as the reality of temptation, the distortion of truth, and the misuse of freedom. Where temperance reveals integration and harmony, the devil shows disintegration, division, and slavery to false powers. Tomberg is clear that the devil is not an independent principle equal to God, but a fallen reality, a distortion of the good. Evil, he insists, is parasitic. It has no substance of its own, but feeds on the misuse of divine gifts. The chains in the image symbolize how sin enslaves not through external force, but through inner consent. People bind themselves when they mistake selfish desire for freedom. The devil represents the illusions of pride, greed, lust, and power that promise fulfillment, but lead only to emptiness. The meditation also explores the mystery of evil in a Christian Hermetic perspective. Tomberg acknowledges that evil is a real force that must be confronted, but he emphasizes that it is always subject to God's sovereignty. Even temptation can serve a higher purpose by forcing the soul to exercise freedom and strengthen virtue. In this sense, the devil is not to be worshipped or feared as ultimate, but to be recognized as the shadow side of freedom, the possibility of saying no to God. For the seeker, the devil is a call to vigilance and discernment. Just as temperance shows the path of integration, the devil warns of the danger of disintegration. Every temptation presents a choice between freedom in God and slavery to illusion. The devil's power lies in deception, and the antidote is truth. By naming and unmasking these illusions, the seeker can resist their power and reclaim the freedom to love. Together, temperance and the devil form a striking pair. Temperance shows the possibility of harmony through grace, while the devil shows the danger of disharmony through sin. One reveals the soul integrated and united. The other reveals the soul fragmented and chained. The sequence reflects the tension inherent in human freedom. The same powers that can be used for harmony can also be misused for destruction. Tomberg uses these meditations to remind the reader that spiritual progress is not a smooth ascent but a constant struggle between integration and fragmentation, grace and temptation, freedom and bondage. At this stage of the tarot journey, the seeker has passed through sacrifice and death, found renewal and temperance, and now faces the reality of evil. The path becomes more urgent as the choices carry greater consequences. Yet the message remains clear. God's grace is stronger than temptation, and the soul, by choosing love and truth, can overcome even the most seductive illusions. The 16th meditation focuses on the Tower Arcana 16, often depicted as a tall structure being struck by lightning, with figures falling from it. Tomberg interprets this as the sudden destruction of false structures, illusions, and pride. If previous arcana, such as the devil and the hanged man, revealed bondage and voluntary sacrifice, the tower represents the dramatic intervention of divine truth to break what is unstable or counterfeit. It is a card of crisis, upheaval, and necessary transformation. Tomberg stresses that the tower is not punishment but revelation. The lightning symbolizes divine illumination, cutting through the illusions of ego and exposing the foundations that are not grounded in truth. The falling figures reflect human attachment to the false, whether in pride, materialism, or self-deception. The tower teaches that moments of radical destruction can be liberating if the soul is willing to embrace them with humility and faith. It is the shattering of false securities to make way for authentic spiritual life. The 17th meditation is on the star Arcana 17, a card depicting a woman pouring water into a river and onto the land beneath a starry sky. Following the destruction of the tower, the star represents hope, inspiration, and the guidance of divine light. Whereas the tower destroys, the star heals. It is a symbol of spiritual renewal, the flow of grace, and the promise of divine guidance after turmoil. Tomberg emphasizes that the star teaches the seeker to trust in God's providence and to remain aligned with the eternal light, even after experiencing upheaval or loss. The star also represents clarity of vision and the restoration of faith. The water poured into the river and the earth symbolizes the soul's openness to divine influence, to allowing spiritual life to nourish both inner and outer worlds. It reassures the seeker that periods of suffering are not permanent, and that renewal, inspiration, and divine blessing always follow moments of crisis when one remains faithful. The 18th meditation turns to the Moon Arcana 18, a card often depicting a moonlit path flanked by two towers, with a dog and wolf howling and a crayfish emerging from the water. Tomberg interprets the moon as the archetype of illusion, fear, and the hidden depths of the unconscious. The card challenges the seeker to navigate the subtle terrain of the soul, where deception, anxiety, and instinctive drives can obscure the path to truth. The moon represents the tension between appearance and reality. The two towers symbolize boundaries, but the path between them is uncertain, reflecting the trials of discernment. The dog and wolf indicate the dual nature of instincts, domesticated and wild, conscious and unconscious. The crayfish emerging from the water represents the emergence of hidden aspects of the psyche. Tomberg emphasizes that the seeker must cultivate vigilance, discernment, and humility when confronting the mysteries of the inner life. Together, the tower, the star, and the moon form a sequence of trial, hope, and discernment. The tower shatters illusions and false foundations. The star restores faith and guides the soul. The moon illuminates the hidden challenges that remain. Tomberg presents these arcana as a meditation on the soul's journey through disruption and renewal, showing that spiritual maturity requires both surrender to divine truth and the courage to face the unknown within oneself. At this stage of the journey, the seeker has encountered destruction, illumination, and the subtle illusions of the inner world. The tarot shows that the path to God is neither linear nor safe, but it is guided by divine wisdom, light, and grace. The lessons of this set of arcana emphasize humility, vigilance, and trust, recognizing that even when the world and the self seem unstable, God's guidance is always present for those who seek it. The 19th meditation examines the Sun Arcanum 19, a card that radiates light, joy, and clarity. Tomberg interprets it as the archetype of illumination, truth, and the joyous realization of divine life. After the trials of the tower, the inspiration of the star, and the discernment of the moon, the sun represents the full flowering of spiritual insight. It symbolizes the soul's awakening to the presence of God in all things, the victory of light over darkness, and the joy that accompanies union with divine wisdom. Tomberg emphasizes that the sun is not merely happiness in worldly terms, but a profound serenity and illumination that transcends circumstance. The figures or symbols in the card reflect harmony, innocence, and authentic vitality. The sun illuminates the path for the seeker, revealing that spiritual enlightenment is both a gift of grace and the fruit of disciplined practice. It signifies clarity of mind, purity of heart, and the radiant confidence that comes from walking in accordance with divine law. The 20th meditation turns to Judgment Arcanum XX, a card depicting a celestial trumpet calling forth the dead. Tomberg interprets this as the archetype of spiritual awakening, discernment, and self-realization in the light of divine truth. It represents the moment of final reckoning, not as fear or punishment, but as the unveiling of the soul's true nature. Judgment calls the seeker to full consciousness, to recognition of personal responsibility, and to alignment with eternal values. For Tomberg, judgment is both a personal and cosmic principle. On the individual level, it is the call to wake from the illusions of ego and to see life in its eternal context. On the cosmic level, it represents the harmony of creation restored in the presence of God. The meditation emphasizes that true awakening requires honesty, courage, and acceptance of divine law. Judgment integrates all previous lessons, choice, discipline, surrender, and illumination, and calls the seeker to live in full alignment with spiritual reality. The 21st meditation focuses on the world Arcana 21, the culmination of the major Arcana. The world represents completion, wholeness, and the fulfillment of the spiritual journey. Tomberg interprets it as the archetype of integration, where the soul, having passed through trials, initiation, and transformation, now participates fully in the divine order. The figure or symbols in the world reflect harmony, balance, and the dynamic unity of opposites. The world is not an end in a static sense, but the realization of life lived in accordance with God's will. It shows that the spiritual journey is cyclical and continuous, with each cycle leading to deeper understanding. Tomberg emphasizes that wholeness involves both inner and outer dimensions, moral, intellectual, and spiritual, all harmonized. The world teaches that the completion of one stage is preparation for the next, and that spiritual fulfillment is dynamic, not merely a static state of being. Finally, the 22nd meditation examines the Fool Arcanum 0, the paradoxical card that begins and ends the journey. Tomberg interprets the Fool as the archetype of openness, trust, and infinite potential. The Fool embodies the beginning of the path, the leap of faith, and the openness to divine guidance. By placing the Fool at the end, Tomberg emphasizes that spiritual maturity involves a return to simplicity, innocence, and trust. Having integrated all lessons of the journey, the Fool represents the soul ready to embark again, infinitely, into deeper communion with God. Concluding reflections. Across the 22 Arcana, Tomberg presents a coherent vision of spiritual growth, blending Christian theology with Hermetic symbolism. The path moves from attention and receptivity to the magician, the high priestess, through creativity, order, and authority, the empress, the emperor, the pope, into choice and mastery, the lovers, the chariot, through discernment and inner illumination, justice, the hermit, the wheel, strength, into sacrifice and transformation, the hanged man, death, the balance of forces, temperance, the devil, trial and renewal, the tower, the star, the moon, culminating in illumination, awakening and wholeness, the sun, judgment, the world with a return to openness and trust, the Fool. Tomberg's work emphasizes that the spiritual journey is not linear, but dynamic, requiring active attention, humility, discernment, courage, and love. Every card serves as both a mirror and a guide, revealing the challenges and possibilities inherent in human life, pointing beyond the self to God. The tarot in Tomberg's hands becomes a living map of the soul's ascent, integrating Christian wisdom, mystical insight, and universal esoteric principles. It teaches that the path to God is a journey of transformation, where the soul passes from awakening to maturity, from struggle to harmony, and ultimately to unity with the divine. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Meditations on the Tarot by Valentin Tomberg. If you enjoyed exploring these spiritual insights and want to continue your journey of mindfulness and personal growth, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a new meditation.